when USA for UNHCR got 100,000 net new donors to file, your file basically doubled. You had to rethink where you position them in the context of the giving pyramid.
Yep.
How has your thinking changed about who these donors really are? And how has that influenced how you want to talk to them and how you wanted to treat them?
Specifically for the new-to-file supporters that we gained who wanted to support those who had been impacted in Ukraine, our initial response was we need to retain. And that was our metric for success of retention, is are they giving again? That wasn't working. If a donor isn't retained, do we just give up on this donor segment, or do we approach them differently? And does the ask become something different? And so one of the things that we've started to do in this past year is to start segmenting donors. And so we started with 3 segments. These segments are women, they are faith-based, and they are emergency donors. And so we started to incorporate things like, you gave to the Ukraine emergency, here's a text message to quiz you on your understanding of the humanitarian situation in Sudan. There's no call to action to give. The call to action is really just to learn more and to get opportunities to be engaged with USA for UNHCR, providing these donors with awareness and education resources to be thinking about UNHCR as the top organization that comes to mind when there is a crisis that forces people to flee. But it takes that work of the non-financial engagement that doesn't have the immediate payoff, so that when there is an emergency, we're the top charity they think about.
Lacey Stone, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What I realized is that you are in this really pivotal moment. You aren't just managing the organization. You are on a journey of transforming how USA for UNHCR thinks about giving.
I think so. I think that 2 things are simultaneously happening. One is that USA for UNHCR has embarked on a new 5-year strategic plan, and that strategic plan launched this year. Simultaneously, the development division that I oversee, we launched our 3-year strategy under the umbrella of that USA for UNHCR strategic plan. And contained within both the development strategy as well as the USA for UNHCR strategic plan, we have some incredibly ambitious goals and are working towards outcomes for the next 5 years that I think would have been deemed impossible just 3 or 4 years ago. And so to be a part of that and to be leading through this transformational change, it's a really cool experience for me. It's also a little bit scary, right? Because we're doing something that the organization has never done before, but we're building the structure to make that possible and to build ourselves to be ready for success, for future fundraising, as well as the other pillars of our strategic plan. But of course, I'm most interested in the mobilizing resources fundraising side.
Did something have to happen in the past where the organization almost built up enough chutzpah? There were enough experiences that happened over the last couple of years where you have all decided that this ambitious goal was something to pursue?
It did, and I'll even back up a little bit because I think, my CEO says this and I have fully bought in, which is that if your goal doesn't scare you at least a little bit, then it's not ambitious enough. And so I really embraced that, and a goal is just that. It's a goal. It's not something that if we don't reach this financial goal in 5 years, then we're ruined, right? It's something to get excited about. It's something to galvanize and mobilize the team around. It's a way for us all to be working towards the same outcome in a concerted fashion. And so just the ability of a big, audacious, and scary goal is something that I think is generating at least a lot of staff interest and excitement around how are we going to make this happen. But to get to your question around, kind of what has happened to get us there, I think that the war in Ukraine, when that broke out, that triggered what has become the largest private sector fundraising response that USA for UNHCR has ever been able to mobilize. I mean, we were completely overwhelmed in a positive way about the private sector response to the Ukraine crisis. And that really triggered this response for USA for UNHCR to say, we need to think differently about what the future holds for us. We need to adapt to be able to meet this incredible demand from the private sector in wanting to get engaged with us. But I think even more importantly, we need to build the foundation and the structure, the infrastructure, to be able to be set up for success in the future, not just to respond to large-scale emergencies when they strike, but also to be set up to deliver sustainable solutions and to deliver fundraising results for those sustainable solutions that UNHCR works to provide.
And you've been in the C-suite role for the last 2 years.
Almost 2 years, yep.
It just happens that when you step into the role, this was in the midst of the war in Ukraine taking place.
Exactly. And I was the head of partnerships prior to that. So working with organizational partners supporting USA for UNHCR.
And you said that you guys had to think differently about your donors exactly because of the crisis in Ukraine. Can you share any numbers, any statistics around what you saw happen in the last 2-3 years in terms of your donors? And how did that force you to think differently?
Absolutely. So the response, like I said, was overwhelming from the private sector, and that's primarily who USA for UNHCR works with. We work with the private sector, including individuals, corporations, foundations, et cetera. And the response that we received was so overwhelming that we added about 100,000 new donors to our file, which was about almost double our entire donor file. And what we first started to do when we received this outstanding response was to think in terms of retention. How are we going to retain these donors who have come to us through the Ukraine response? And I think we were a bit, in hindsight, naive to have a target of retaining 90% of those new one-time donors. But we weren't set up to effectively steward those donors to be able to be in a place to retain them. And so it's not surprising to me in hindsight that we weren't able to meet that 90% or even close to that target, because we were set up to really incentivize internally and to have goals around one-time acquisition. And that meant that when we brought in new donors, whether they were giving to an emergency like the war in Ukraine or they were giving to a long-term program like education, that we were only really set up to continue to ask them to donate again. And that was one donor journey that no matter how you came into USA for UNHCR, you got put into that donor journey, which was to continually ask you to give again. Few and far between were the opportunities to understand the impact that your donation made and to take a step back and to engage with the organization in a non-financial type of way. And so it really forced us to take that step back and say, if we're not retaining these donors, this isn't working, continuing to ask and ask and ask for more money, why isn't it working and what should we be doing differently? And so we did take that step back and realized that if I'm in the shoes of somebody who has given to this emergency situation and the organization that I'm giving to is only continuing to ask me for more and more, I'm not really feeling that attached to the organization. I'm not feeling like my donation is making much, if any, of an impact. And I'm not feeling like this organization really values me because they're just continuing to ask me for more and more. And so one of the things that we did when I came into the role is we stood up a stewardship team for the very first time. And the stewardship team essentially serves as this team within the organization that is able to provide meaningful engagement opportunities for our donors to connect with our mission. Some of those might have a call to action that is to donate, and it could be financial, but most of the opportunities that the stewardship team is providing are those that are non-financial. in nature, to really provide deliberate and intentional opportunities for our donors to understand how their support can make an impact for the 122 million people around the world who have been forced to flee. And that might seem like a really small and obvious switch to talk to donors about the impact they're making, but I don't think it's something that we were doing very well when the emergency started.
I find that how we show up in one place is how we operate somewhere else. And you and I spoke about, if I may share that, our adventures on bikes, right?
Yes.
And, when I think back to when I first got on a mountain bike 9 years ago, I forget about the progress I've made. And maybe we forget about the progress that we make on skis or when snowshoeing or when just doing new things. It can be spinning class, whatever it is, running. But we kind of forget where we started and where we are today. I have to imagine that the same applies to what happened over the last 2 years in your role, that maybe today the clarity is there, that the stewardship team was the right vehicle to develop to increase engagement. But I imagine that there are a number of internal conversations that you guys have had to enable this 5-year plan that you embarked on now. Just give me lift the veil a little bit on what was actually happening internally for you guys to say, I'm getting 100,000 net new donors. They're not being retained at 90%.
Yeah.
I have to think about this differently. Like you said, I have to take a step back. How did you take a step back?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things come to mind. One, and I'll just start by saying that I think if you were to ask my coworkers, I think that across the board, people would say that I'm a bit boring. And I embrace that.
That is not my experience with talking to you.
So I think I'm a bit boring when it comes to the things that I find really exciting at work. In my personal life, I love to take risks. I love to go on adventures. I love to be outdoors. In my professional life, what I have realized since coming into this role is that the risks that we needed to take, the areas that we really needed to build out weren't these big, shiny, new things. It was building process. It was building the infrastructure that we needed to be successful for the long term. There aren't a lot of people who get super excited about talking about process and infrastructure. I love a good standard operating procedure. I love finding order within the chaos and then applying that order so that we can have predictability and consistency in the work that we do. And I think that's the piece that was lacking within our development division when I came into this role, is that infrastructure and those systems and those processes to be able to be set up for long-term success. We were really good at one-off acquisition. We are really good at emergency fundraising. But where we need to focus a lot of our effort is that lifetime value of our donors, of connecting donors to our mission, of building that loyalty and that commitment. And that takes time, but it also takes good processes, good systems, and good infrastructure to be set up to provide that consistent experience and to be able to understand why a donor comes to USA for UNHCR, what incentivizes them to want to stay, and what is our unique value that we provide to them so that we remain a top charity of choice throughout their lifetime. And that might look different for different donors, but we can create systems that are able to put certain segments of donors into different donor journeys to meet them where they are and provide that level of consistent stewardship to help them feel connected to the mission throughout their lifetime.
Look, I love your point about process, because what I'm experiencing right now in my role is exactly that. They need to focus on systems, on processes, because that's the only way that you can scale. But I also think that sometimes process gets a bad rep, because we think about process and we think about bureaucracy, or we think about, I have to stay in these swim lanes and I have to kind of mechanically do these things. And yet I think that process, when functioning within a bigger framework and when it answers the right why, is exactly the right thing to do. And you were sharing with me earlier that when USA for UNHCR got 100,000 net new donors to file. Your file basically doubled. You had to rethink where you positioned them in the context of the giving pyramid.
Yep.
And I think that has then influenced your process. How has your thinking changed about who these donors really are? And how has that influenced how you wanted to talk to them and how you wanted to treat them?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think specifically for the new to file supporters that we gained who wanted to support those who had been impacted in Ukraine, when I think about those donors and our initial response was we need to retain. What we realized is what we were doing by just continuing to ask them for money, and that was our metric for success of retention is are they giving again? That wasn't working. We had to do something different. And we started to think about, okay, if a donor isn't retained through the Ukraine emergency, we're continuing to ask them for money, they're not responding. Is that necessarily a negative thing? Or can we talk to them differently? And instead of trying to take an emergency donor who came in, it doesn't have to be Ukraine, right? Take any emergency situation. And I'll think about some of the big kind of CNN headline grabbing emergencies that we'll get one-time emergency acquisition donors through. We had historically been hyper-focused on retention of those one-time donors, and we were kind of spinning our wheels because we were finding rare cases of success of retaining those donors. And so we did take that step back and thought, well, maybe retention of these one-time donors to continue to give either to the same emergency situation or to a completely different program or, the creme de la creme, unrestricted, flexible funding. If that's not working, do we just give up on this donor segment or do we approach them differently? And does the ask become something different? And so one of the things that we've started to do in this past year as part of our development strategy is to start segmenting donors. And we're starting, and as we segment donors, we're thinking specifically about audience centricity. What are the segments of donors that are the ones we need to start with? And we're not going to be everything to everyone. So we've started with 3 segments, and these segments are women, they are faith-based, and they are emergency donors. And then under that, we have other segments like sustainers, that sort of thing. But the demographic audience segments and the behavioral audience segments are interconnected here. And so when we think about emergency donors, could we segment them and reach them in a way that is unique to why they gave in the first place, and to use opportunities to speak with them, to help them understand and to help educate them on who UNHCR is, why UNHCR matters in times of emergency, and why UNHCR matters outside of a CNN headline-grabbing emergency. And so we started to incorporate things like, okay, you gave to the Ukraine emergency. Here's a text message to quiz you on your understanding of the humanitarian situation in Sudan. There's no call to action to give. The call to action is really just to learn more and to get engaged. Or can we reach you by inviting you to a virtual mission visit to Ukraine where you hear from humanitarian aid workers on the ground and you hear directly from refugees themselves who have fled to other countries or those who are internally displaced within Ukraine to tell you personally what the support from UNHCR has meant to them. Again, no fundraising ask, simply an opportunity to engage with that specific segment of donors that we know is interested in responding to an emergency, to provide them content and opportunities to be engaged with USA for UNHCR because of that interest in emergencies, but not just continuing to ask them for more money. And then when there is another CNN headline-grabbing emergency, the hope and the intent is that we will be top of mind because we will have spent a year or 2 years really providing these donors with awareness and education resources to be thinking about UNHCR as the top organization that comes to mind when there is a crisis that forces people to flee. But it takes that work of the non-financial engagement that doesn't have the immediate payoff, so that when there is an emergency, we're the top charity they think about.
Did you have this clarity when pitching the CEO on allocating resources to create the stewardship team?
Yes and no. I had an idea that this was going to be something that would lead to success. I had experience working in other organizations that non-financial engagement and stewardship was important, but I didn't have data within USA for UNHCR to back up what that financial value could be to the organization. I knew what the cost would be in hard costs, staff resources, full-time headcount, et cetera. But I think it took a lot of trust for my CEO and my CFO to really join me on this journey, and my CHRO as well, I should say, but the entire C-suite, really having the trust in me as the chief development officer and having the commitment that we're going to try this, what we're doing isn't working. And I never felt a pressure of it not being okay if it didn't succeed. The pressure was on myself that I created because I really wanted this to succeed. But I think what's really great about the culture of USA for UNHCR at that level is that there's so much trust between each of us in the C-suite, and there's a lot of freedom and flexibility to try new things, and there's a lot of freedom and flexibility for it to be okay if those things don't succeed.
We spoke earlier about the fact that you seem to be wired like a marketer. And marketing is intrinsically about taking risks, testing things. And it's frankly, I think, quite unique that you are in an organization where your colleagues at your C-suite level really trust each other, where your kind of marketing wiring can come through and they are responsive to it. And that's not usual when that level of trust exists and when you can apply what is needed right now to a situation. Is there anything specific that you guys do to build that trust? Or is it something that just you were just the right match for each other? It all happened. It's serendipity versus you're actually working hard as an executive team to build that trust?
I think it's a few things. I mean, one is we're all fairly new to our roles in that my CFO, CEO, and myself have all been with the organization for less than 5 years. So my CHRO would be the one with the longest tenure. But I think that there has been a very intentional and deliberate effort in each of those individuals coming to the organization through the hiring process to focus on the culture that we want to build. I consider myself incredibly lucky and privileged, and I don't mean this in a Pollyanna-ish way. I consider myself incredibly fortunate and privileged that I get to work with the people I get to work with. I think that's a rarity. And I have said to my husband, I have said in public settings many, many times, I have such loyalty and such commitment to my colleagues in the C-suite and with my CEO because I know how special it is that we have this trusting relationship. I know that I can come to her with anything that is happening that is good, bad, ugly, beautiful, and I will have her support. And it will be a non-judgmental place of support. And again, I know how special that is. And that's not just with the CEO, it's across the C-suite. And that intentional and deliberate culture building, I think, has to start at the top because that's the culture that we want to see in the entire organization. And if we aren't demonstrating those values, how could we possibly expect our teams to do the same?
There's a framework that I follow at my firm called 5 Dysfunctions of the Team.
I love that, yeah.
Lencioni. So I don't know if you guys use that, but it talks about trust is really vulnerability and risk-taking. Then if I have trust, I have healthy conflict. We can disagree, maybe even, raise our voices, but we know it's in service to the next step, which is alignment.
Yep.
So I'm committed now because we spoke about it. Then I am accountable as number 4, and that drives results.
Yeah.
So what I find refreshing about that framework is that it's not about sort of kumbaya, safe space, and I can say whatever I want, and I won't be judged. Yes, it is about that, but it isn't through the lens of my sensitivities have to be managed. It's through the lens of I am really committed to making this organization amazing, to having impact.
Yeah.
I am supposed to be a social impact organization, after all. I like that better than a charity, by the way, because social impact literally means I will create value. I'll have impact. It's not a handout. And if I want to have impact, yes, I have to have a culture of trust so I can go through all the steps so I can create results. And this is really a startup-like culture, by the way. Like, it's not, I don't think it's very typical either.
Well, I love that you mentioned the 5 dysfunctions, because it's actually something that my development team, and we call ourselves the development management team. So the senior directors from my division, my direct reports, who then oversee each of the fundraising verticals, we've gone through as an exercise the 5 dysfunctions, and the area that we've really put a lot of emphasis on is accountability. And I think that accountability piece shines through, because what I will communicate to my team is that, look, I have an accountability not just to each of my direct reports, not just to the development division, not just to my CEO and my peers in the C-suite, but I have an accountability. We all have an accountability to the 122 million people around the world who have been forced to flee. I feel like the risk of that getting lost is really great in an organization that is a fundraising organization for a global cause. You get caught up in the day-to-day, the systems, the processes, but I think that it is so important to always be able to remember and reflect that your accountability doesn't just stop within your team when you work for a nonprofit social impact organization, but you have an accountability to those that you serve. And is the work that you are doing, is it ultimately benefiting them? And I think that lens is super helpful. But then on the internal side, that accountability, I think, helps us as a value to be more comfortable moving outside of our lanes. And we encourage each other to call something out. In the New York subway system, if you see something, say something. If one of my team members sees something that might not be their vertical, might not be even within the development division, maybe they see something happening in finance or HR, whatever it may be, and they think, hey, I'm curious to learn more about this, or I have an idea that could help us to create a more streamlined, more efficient, whatever it may be. That kind of calling out is encouraged, highly encouraged. And I encourage that behavior within my entire development division. We encourage that behavior across the organization because, again, your accountability is not just to your manager and your scope of work. You have an accountability to USA for UNHCR, and we all have an accountability to the refugees that we serve.
So the war in Ukraine starts, right? You are in a new C-suite role.
Mm-hmm.
USA for UNHCR gets 100,000 net new, really donors, but potential donors, leads to the file.
Yeah.
There is a stewardship team that's being created to change messaging a little bit away from donate now to let me educate you. I want to have a relationship with you. You also spoke about creating 3 segments, faith-based, women, emergency, because you're anticipating that there will unfortunately be other emergencies in the future, and you want to change the conversation when that happens. You want to be ready for it. That's why process comes in.
Mm-hmm.
How are you thinking about that plan? Is there a framework that you're thinking about that describes it? And then I'm really curious about other elements of what you want to do. But let's start with the framework. What is sort of your philosophy around what you want to move towards, what you want to build as a blueprint over the next 3 years?
Yeah, so I will say the word to describe the plan would be iterative, right? It's a plan, and we have goals attached to this plan, but the intent is not that this is a static document or a static framework that doesn't change. The world changes, and we have to be able to adapt. And so what I'm excited about with the strategic plan is that we have this iteration naturally built in. And what I mean by that is we have this framework, we have this plan, we have these goals, but now we've empowered this is a leadership table that we call our senior leadership group. And it's the senior directors from across the organization and other leaders from different divisions, but it's a cross-departmental initiative that has representatives from each department across USA for UNHCR. And those senior leaders are now coming together in an intentional way to develop the KPIs that are going to be attached to each goal as part of the pillars of the strategic plan that each of the team members are going to be proud of and committed to and aligned around in delivering to the organization. Now, it might be that after this exercise of going through the KPIs, we might discover, oh, hey, to reach this really audacious target, it's actually going to take quite a bit more investment than we had imagined when we formulated the strategic plan. That's okay. That's actually fantastic. What I would hate to see is for our team to continue to work towards a goal that they don't feel is something that is ever going to be possible, and we just keep doing the same things over and over. But we have empowered this strategic leaders group to look cross-departmentally, to look cross-functionally and say, okay, we've got a KPI, let's say a KPI for a great place to work on the human resources side is X. There is now an empowerment of all of the senior leaders across the organization to really scrutinize that and say, is that the right KPI? If I'm a people leader, is that a KPI that actually is valuable and meaningful to me? And to look at things like branding, to look at things like engaging our network of supporters to see, do we have the right pieces in place there to reach the fundraising goal? So for the first time, this strategic plan, I would say, is a fully integrated and interconnected type of strategic plan, where previously, or previous versions rather, had been intentionally quite siloed and intentionally quite siloed in such a way that I remember when I was leading the partnerships team, even reporting out to our board, okay, we need to report out on this pillar of the strategic plan. Lacey, you're pillar 5. So how is that going for you? And now it's not just the development division's strategic pillar of the plan, it's all of USA for UNHCR's plan. And yes, there are individuals and teams that have accountability and responsibility for the delivery of those goals. But everybody in the organization has ownership over this strategic plan as this living and iterative document that they get to directly weigh into and feedback to say, we are not on track to hitting this, we need to adjust, or we need to shift investments so that we're really focusing on this piece because it's all related. So if we don't hit this target on brand, if we don't hit this target on engaging a network, then we'll never be able to be positioned to hit the target on mobilizing resources. And it's really forcing, I think, some super healthy conversations and at times really healthy conflict, because these things naturally come up against one another. Investment is not unlimited. There are going to be finite resources to put behind, and there's going to be a tiered and timed structure of when investments can be made. And again, it's all dependent on the funding that we're able to raise. But to treat any of that as a siloed vertical, I think is a mistake, and it's a mistake that we had fallen into in the past.
I'm hearing two things. One is this topic of breaking down silos, internal silos. Mm-hmm. I think everyone is experiencing this in all industries, not just in the non-for-profit sector. I see this also in financial services. I see this in education. We all want to own something, and we don't really want someone else to tell us what to do or get into our area of responsibility. And yet we are interconnected, and yet we're supposedly stronger together. Was it hard to actually push these targets down to your senior team? Did you guys have at exec level conversations around, we can't accomplish this big goal unless the people who actually report to us are on board and they operate differently? Was this a conscious choice, or did they just sort of happen organically?
This was a very conscious choice. And this is something that is currently happening right now. It is in process, but it was a conscious choice to stand up this senior leadership group that has cross-departmental representation across the organization, and it was a deliberate and intentional choice for, we call ourselves the ELG, the Executive Leadership Group at the C-level, and it was a deliberate choice for the ELG to empower the senior leadership group with the strategic plan to say your teams are going to be the teams that are responsible for implementing this plan, and these are the targets that you will be accountable for. Do you agree first? And if so, what are the KPIs that we're going to measure against over the next 5 years to see if we're successful? Now, in year one, we have these goals, and we're not going to change what those goals are in year one, right? We want the experience of a year under our belt to understand and to measure ourselves against the KPIs to see, are we successful? Is this possible? And where do we potentially need to make adjustments? And that includes adjustments for just the reality of the world around us, right? The financial situation is changing. Now more than ever, private sector support is needed, as we know governments are pulling back their support, not just in the U.S., but globally. So these gaps that are being created, we have to figure out a way to galvanize more private sector support because the risk is just too great. Refugee lives hang in the balance, right? And so we need to do everything we can to increase that private sector support. So the ownership and the accountability of this senior leaders group, as it's in process, I would say that this is something that culturally, folks are really diving into. They're diving into because they know how important it is and because everybody is aligned and committed to the overall success of the organization because, again, that means potential lives saved. And what greater mission or purpose is there?
It's uncanny how your ELG team, that's my ELT team, right? Executive Leadership Team group. And we also are, over the last year, have been focusing increasingly on our SLT or SLG team.
Love the acronyms.
Yeah. There's many strange similarities here because we have realized, and I think that's what you're saying, that we can't get, and we also have pretty ambitious goals, that we can't realize these goals if we don't galvanize the team internally. And again, there are so many parallels here to I need to galvanize the private sector to help me to get to my targets. And I also need to, at the same time galvanize, look to the inside and galvanize my team so that we hold hands together. But I can't just expect them to do that.
Right. Well, I think that's such an important piece of it that sometimes can get lost is that when we initially stood up the SLG, I don't think that we had given as much thought as perhaps we should have about the work that would need to go into trust building within that team. And part of that reason is that as an ELG, we've been working together now since I've been on board for 2 years. And so, we're meeting regularly, we're having healthy conflict, we're having these conversations. But as you do that over time, you organically build trust. You organically build a lot of comfort in having uncomfortable conversations. And then we stood up the SLG, and it was kind of like, okay, SLG exists. Now you're empowered.
Go change things.
Can't wait to see what you come up with. But there hadn't been that deliberate effort and time built in to build the trust. And a lot of that comes with working together. And so that will happen. That will continue to happen. It will continue to grow over time. But of course, the early stages before this is, the first time this team has ever come together as a team. And we're saying, let us know what the KPIs are.
When was that?
Recently, just a few months ago. Yeah, very recent. So we're working through it now. But every conversation, every meeting, every time the SLG comes together, the feedback I get from my team every single time is, it was so much better. Oh my gosh, so much improvement. And so every time they're getting together, things are improving, trust is building, the comfort level is building, comfort with just calling each other out on, not in a bad or negative way, but calling out to say, I don't understand that. Can you share more? I'm curious about what that means. And as that comfort builds, so too is the performance of that team really driving towards the results that the ELG has tasked them with. But that trust building, that relationship building, I think that's an element and a piece that as professionals, a lot of time, we think about collaboration. Who doesn't want to collaborate? Collaboration is a great word. We all want to collaborate.
We're all social animals.
Right. But are we setting up the processes and the infrastructure to make collaboration successful? And it's not, I think that's a hard sell sometimes to dedicate time, resources, and energy into team building, into trust building. But ultimately, if you don't invest the time, the energy, and the resources into those things, then you are setting yourself up to continue to work in silos no matter what happens. You have to build the trust to be able to break it down and actually work together.
How I think about this as a journey, donor journey, is people come in from different emergencies. Mm-hmm. They maybe gave one time to USA for UNHCR. Are they really a donor or are they just a lead? I think they're just a record with a credit card attached. If I remember correctly, based on research, only 13% of one-time donors donate again, not 90%. Yeah. But if I can go from 13% to 20%, I've just increased my retention rate to become a regular giver by 50%.
Well, and I think there also, so I didn't know the 13% statistic. It doesn't surprise me. I think that is how it plays out in what we see as well. But I think that there are also really simple things that can be done that I would argue are innovative. They're not big and shiny and even that new, but simply asking a different way. And so we have changed our website, our donate website, to the first page you see is a request to become a monthly donor. And you can toggle it to one time if you don't want to become a monthly donor, that's fine. But all of our donation asks at that individual giving level that come through on our email marketing, come through on our digital ads, come through in our newsletter and direct mail, the first request is to be a monthly donor, and we specifically talk to you about the importance of that sustainable support and the impact you can make by becoming a monthly donor. And so building in from the very beginning stages that comfort level and really socializing the importance of becoming a monthly donor rather than trying to shift the behavior after you bring in a one-time giver. Because the 13%, that's not a number I like. That's not a good statistic. But if you start as a monthly donor, then you're already in the door. And then you get to build your loyalty, build your commitment over time. But the ask then, maybe the next ask is to give an additional gift if you're doing a fundraising ask. Maybe the fundraising ask is to increase your giving. Maybe it's not a fundraising ask at all, but you're already a monthly donor that's helping us to build that sustainable support that is crucial for the long-term success of UNHCR.
So you mentioned that your SLG team now has KPIs and that the target isn't changing for year one. And it is also a bit of an experiment, right? We will see what will happen. We're probably moving in the right direction, but we just aren't sure yet how this exactly will play out. Can you shed light on some of those KPIs? And there's a framework, by the way, called EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System, that I think you guys are following without calling it this way. And that framework has exactly something called balanced scorecard that has both operating and financial targets. So I think your KPIs are probably a version of the balanced scorecard. I imagine that increasing count of donors, or share of donors who are maybe one time to be regular is a metric you're aiming to increase.
Absolutely.
any other metrics like that you can share that you believe are important to getting you to that big goal?
So I don't want to do this too soon because we are, as an ELG, receiving as a presentation from the SLG the draft KPIs at the beginning of April. So you'll have to have me back in April and I can share what the KPIs
I may have to
are.
Do that, yes.
But I will tell you that the number of one-time donors and regular donors absolutely is going to be one of the big KPIs that we're looking at. And increasing and then retaining the number of regular donors is going to be incredibly important. But we'll also have stewardship metrics built in to that, and that hopefully will be directly related to our ability to retain, whether it's monthly or one-time donors, is, what is the magic recipe? What's the right number for the number of non-financial engagements, and is there a correlation in these donors that are staying with us? Is it because they had the opportunity to learn about the impact of their support because they did a virtual program visit? Did they do an experiential activity? We'll be tracking all of the possible data that we can to see what is it that is really that magic sauce, if there is one, to keep donors with us year over year.
It really feels like you're trying to bake something or cook something amazing. And like you said, that meal that may take 3 years to cook, and just stay with me for a second. It may take 3 years, but there is a recipe. And every recipe has ingredients, and there's also a way to mix the ingredients in a specific order. And that's back to your point about process. And I like how you said a while back that you take risks in your kind of personal life, but you lean into process at work. Isn't that simply the recipe for baking that amazing, right, experience in 3 years for my friends or my family? And I do agree with you. I think there is certain beauty in changing how we operate. There's a certain elegance in it. Our teams coming together, helping us get to our goals. We need them to do this for us, for the organization, ultimately for the people who we serve, who get the aid. KPIs are part of that recipe. Being flexible along the way is part of the recipe as well. So just your point about process and system is boring, and yet it is exactly what makes rubber hit the road.
Yeah.
This podcast isn't about me, it's about you. But that really resonates with me.
Well, and I think the other part of the recipe, and I love this metaphor, I think the other part of the recipe is ensuring you have the right team members in place to move the work forward. And so I mentioned, we're so intentional about the culture that we want to have as USA for UNHCR. We go, I think, to great lengths to nurture and cultivate this really positive culture internally. And a big part of that is in hiring. I think one of the greatest responsibilities I have in my role is to, one, ensure that we have the right team members in place, but two, to make sure that those team members have the resources that they need to be successful. And it's not about, me going and doing the implementation, and it's not about me going and writing an email that's going to be used for digital marketing or me going to meet with a corporate partner. It's really about asking my team, this is the plan, these are the KPIs that you have put forward, what do you need to be successful in this plan? And then unlocking resources and removing barriers for them, because we have entrusted them to do a really important job. So let's make it as easy as possible for them to do it.
So that could be a whole another topic for another podcast interview, because what I think you're bringing up, there is this phrase, do you hire well or do you train well? And in a way, I actually think that hiring well is more important than training. And yet, I also know that training is actually most important. But you have to have the right people.
Yeah.
And then you have to have the right system to enable them to succeed. And lately, both and has been a phrase I've been using, but it's both and. They're both important. And sometimes it's important to have the right people, and sometimes it's important to have the right process, but ultimately both are important. Having said that, when you think about the next 3 years, what worries you the most? What is one area of risk that you're thinking about? Because that's something that you probably would want to mitigate right away, I imagine.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk right now, and this is true for many in our sector, especially in the humanitarian development space across the U.S., is the reduction in public sector, U.S. government support. And so how can we work with the private sector? Because, again, the needs are only increasing. When I first started at the organization in 2021, I believe the number was 81 million people who had been forced to flee, and that number is now 122 million. So just to give some perspective,
That's a 50% increase.
In 4 short years, right? And so the needs are only becoming greater and greater. And as we see new reasons for people who are uprooted and forced to flee. It's conflict, violence, persecution, war, but also now increasingly there are climate disasters that are forcing people to be on the move. We're seeing displaced communities who are displaced not just for the first time, but for the second or third time because a climate disaster is exacerbating an already fragile system. And by the way, most of the climate disasters that occur are occurring in some of the most heavily populated host communities for refugees around the world. And so the risk only continues to increase. And so as you have these compounding forces that are causing people to be forced to flee, it is going to require a greater and greater response from the private sector to help meet the needs of those who have been uprooted. And remember, nobody chooses to be a refugee. Nobody chooses to put their child on a boat and go by sea when it's safer on the land. These are people being forced to flee because the other option is likely death. And so they are making impossible choices for the safety and the protection of their families. And yet more and more funding is decreasing, and the opportunity for those individuals to find safety are becoming fewer and fewer. And so, I have the advantage of working for an organization like USA for UNHCR that supports the UN Refugee Agency that is going to stay and deliver no matter what. UNHCR isn't going away, right? I can't say the same is necessarily true for some of our smaller nonprofit partners who may be faced with impossible choices as they are impacted by shrinking funding. And so all of us in the space are impacted by it, but it's how do we react? How do we continue to serve the populations that we serve? And from my lens as a fundraiser, how do we come up with new and creative ways to reach new donors, attract new supporters, keep and retain those that we have, while the landscape becomes ever more crowded in really good causes that are worthy of our support. And so the causes increase, the needs for those that we serve continue to increase, and unfortunately, the funding that we receive is not matching the needs that are continuing to go up.
I speak to many executives, chief development officers, chief philanthropy officers at large international charities. And it's really revealing to hear that this isn't just about the U.S. This is a global issue with governments pulling back. This is happening in Germany, France, in the U.K.
Yep.
And I think that's why, to your point, we have to be ready to lean on the partnership with the private sector more, whether that's mass, mid, or major donors, or whether that's corporations or foundations. That's all important. But then to your point, that does require a different approach. And again, it's an evolution, but you also have this ambitious goal that makes it important for you to change how we think about the next 3 years. And maybe in some ways, breakdowns do lead to breakthroughs. the war in Ukraine was a breakdown. It was a shock to the system. But with USA for UNHCR, maybe in some weird way it was a silver lining that has now enabled you to see a path forward.
Well, and maybe, maybe the war in Ukraine and the private sector support that we received, maybe that was an anomaly. Maybe that was a blip. Like I said, this was the largest fundraising response that we have led in our organization's history at USA for UNHCR. So maybe it was a blip, but maybe it wasn't. And maybe what it means is that this is possible, that it is possible for the private sector to come together, to galvanize for a shared goal of helping humanity. And if that is the case, then it's on us, I think, as a sector to work together and to work collaboratively to understand what are the lessons we can take from that response. Because USA for UNHCR is not alone in having received this outpouring of private sector support for this emergency. My peers in the space and our colleagues also had these overwhelming responses. What if we were to work together and understand what is it that drove this private sector response, and how can we capture some of that to be able to get it back, and not just for a one-time emergency in a specific location, but for that shared humanity that we all have as a value, and you wouldn't have given to our organization if you didn't have that as a value. So how do we get, as we go back to basics, how do we get to that underlying shared value and really attract supporters in a more meaningful way? Maybe it's collaboration, but I think that the notion that this was an anomaly and this is a blip, while possibly true, it could also be an opportunity for us to see what could be possible in the future.
Breakdowns can lead to breakthroughs.
They sure can.
Lacey Stone, Chief Development Officer, USA for UNHCR. Thank you so much for your time. This was great.
This was delightful. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.